Tuesday, January 15th, 2019. That morning, a British Special Air Service operator was somewhere in Nairobi, in a suit and polished shoes, going about what was officially a routine day. He was part of a UK Special Forces team assigned to advise and train Kenyan counter-terrorism units. One of those quiet, foreign military presences that exists in certain capitals without ever being formally acknowledged. Earlier that day, he had given a stranger a lift. The man said something before climbing out of the vehicle. "May God bless you many times today." By 2:30 that afternoon, the city was already different. At around 14:30 East Africa time, a Toyota Ractis pulled through the entrance gate of the 14 Riverside Drive complex in the Westlands district, an upscale compound housing the Dusit D2 luxury hotel, several office blocks, a restaurant called the Secret Garden, parking structures, and a landscaped central courtyard, all surrounded by a high perimeter wall with a single main vehicle entrance. Companies like SAP, LG Electronics, and Adam Smith International maintained offices in those blocks. On a Tuesday afternoon, hundreds of people were at their desks, eating lunch in the restaurant, moving between buildings, living the ordinary mid-afternoon rhythms of a business compound that had no particular reason to be afraid. A fifth man had not arrived in the Toyota. Mahir Khalid Riziki, 25 years old, from the Majengo area of Mombasa, a frequent attender at a mosque commonly associated for nearly a decade as a key radicalization and recruitment center for Al-Shabaab, had entered Kenya separately just 48 hours earlier through a border crossing in Mandera County. He had taken a bus to Nairobi, linked up with the operational cell, received his instructions. On the morning of January 15th, he moved alone toward the Secret Garden restaurant at the interior of the complex. He stood near the entrance for approximately 1 minute. Somewhere in that minute, in what must have felt like nothing to people sitting at nearby tables, he detonated the explosive vest beneath his clothing. 7 people were killed in that initial explosion. The sound of it crossed the compound walls and entered Nairobi's afternoon, carrying past the perimeter into a city that hadn't yet understood what the noise meant. The Toyota Ractis was already through the gate. The 4 gunmen left the vehicle near the entrance and moved quickly. They had rehearsed this. Multiple sources placed a car matching the Ractis's description regularly parked near the site in the weeks before January 15th. A street vendor had noticed the occupants staying inside or stepping out briefly for coffee. A restaurant waiter identified one of the attackers by a prominent scar on his hand, visiting the site 2 days earlier. The cell had studied the compound the way the Pathfinder platoon had studied Iraqi positions, systematically, patiently, from distance. They knew the layout. 2 grenades went toward the vehicles parked near the entrance gate. 2 cars caught fire. People near the entrance ran or fell. The 4 gunmen split into 2 pairs, one pair moving left toward the Hanover office block, the other moving right toward the area where Riziki had just detonated. The weapons they carried, Type 56-2 assault rifles, the Chinese-manufactured AK-47 variant that Al-Shabaab favors, most likely seized from Somali National Army equipment stockpiles, weren't parade ground tools. They were weapons that had been through the logistics chain of a functioning insurgency, functional and familiar in the hands of men who had trained with them. Inside the Hanover block, office workers heard the grenades before they heard the gunfire. Then they heard the gunfire. Hundreds of people who had no plan for this moment, no training, no route, no point of contact, made their own decisions in under 60 seconds. Some locked their office doors. Some hid under desks. Some moved towards stairwells and then stopped, uncertain which direction was safer. Some called family members. A few found internal corridors and began moving deeper into the building, away from the windows. The 4 gunmen regrouped deeper in the compound. They entered the Dusit D2 hotel building and fired at the guests and staff inside. By this point, the compound had become 3 things simultaneously: an active killing zone in the areas where the attackers were moving, a frozen space of people hiding and waiting in offices, bathrooms and stairwells, and a chaotic exterior area where private security personnel and off-duty police officers arriving at the perimeter were trying to understand what was happening inside a high-walled compound from which they could hear gunfire and smell smoke, but couldn't yet see anything clearly. The Kenyan General Service Unit's Recce Company, the country's specialized counter-terror paramilitary police unit, built over the 5 years since Westgate with direct training assistance from US diplomatic security services, was dispatched. A perimeter began assembling around 14 Riverside Drive. Craighead's phone rang. A colleague, unarmed, sheltering in his office somewhere inside or near the complex, told him what was happening. He was still in the suit. He had minutes to move. He went to where his gear was. The Colt Canada C8 rifle, a compact assault rifle chambered in 5.56 millimeters, the standard weapon for British Special Forces, came first. The Glock 17 pistol went on the plate carrier. The plate carrier itself, the body armor that stops rifle rounds at close range, went over civilian clothes. Jeans, not the suit. The balaclava went on. The helmet. He checked the weapon. Then he drove through Nairobi. Westlands on a Tuesday afternoon in January isn't a quiet place. The road network around 14 Riverside Drive runs through one of the city's most congested commercial zones. Office blocks, shopping centres, matatu routes, pedestrians crossing mid-block, the ordinary friction of a major East African capital in the middle of a working day. He threaded through it, aware of what was waiting at the other end, and with no reliable information about what exactly he would find when he arrived. He had described his information state upon arrival with characteristic compression. Little to no intel beyond the sound of gunfire. He reached the perimeter. Whatever he could see from outside the wall, smoke perhaps from the burning vehicles near the gate, the sound of gunfire from inside the compound, the beginning of a police presence at the exterior, was all he had to work with. He found a security guard on the scene, someone who had been present since before the organized police response had fully assembled. He asked a direct question. Were any special forces or police already operating inside the compound? The guard said no. No one was in there. His own account of what happened in the following seconds, given on the Sean Ryan show. No one had told me to go, and no one told me not to go. In the Mulligan Brothers documentary, he added the precision that makes those words matter. I had no authority when he crossed the threshold. He crossed the threshold. What a man carries into a situation like that, beyond the C8 and the Glock and the body armor, is everything the institution put into him over decades. It's worth pausing to understand what that actually meant in Craighead's case, because the capability he deployed at 14 Riverside Drive wasn't generic military competence. It was the specific product of a sequence of experiences and selections that very few people on Earth complete. He had joined 2 PARA at 16. The parachute regiment's standard is demanding. The selection process for the regiment is one of the more physically and mentally grueling in the British Army. But the Pathfinder platoon requires something additional. The Pathfinders exist at the forward edge of what British military doctrine conceives of as acceptable risk. Their missions take them into territory where the nearest friendly forces might be 50 or 100 kilometers away, where there is no immediate quick reaction force, where detection means either a firefight against overwhelming numbers or a controlled evasion that might take days. One mission he has described from his Pathfinder years captures the working conditions. 6 men in reconnaissance against a formation numbering 4,000. The point of that disproportion isn't recklessness. It's a precisely calibrated understanding of what 6 invisible, well-trained men can accomplish that 4,000 soldiers in formation can't, which is to observe and report without triggering the contact that would require a 4,000-man response. But the work requires operating for extended periods in a state of complete tactical isolation, making decisions on the basis of limited information without the comfort of nearby support. 9 years of that. Then SAS selection. The process runs approximately 6 months. The opening phase sends candidates into the Brecon Beacons in Wales, alone, carrying a full combat load, navigating point to point across mountain terrain in conditions that the regiment does not modify for weather. Rain, freezing temperatures, and reduced visibility are features of the environment, not exceptions to be accommodated. Each man moves solo. The checkpoints are time-constrained. The regiment does not tell candidates how many miles they need to cover. Part of the selection is the judgment to keep moving when nothing external compels you to. The process filters the majority before jungle training begins. What it selects for, at its core, isn't brute strength or speed. It's the capacity to sustain high-quality decision-making under conditions where the institutional support for that decision-making has been methodically stripped away. He passed. He served 15 years in 22 SAS, multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan in operations that the MOD does not discuss publicly. By January 2019, he was 43 years old and held the rank of Warrant Officer Class 2, a senior warrant officer grade in the British Army structure, the grade that in the SAS designates a man who hasn't only survived selection and initial service, but has been assessed as capable of leading at the highest levels the regiment offers, below commissioned rank. That is what walked through the gate at 14 Riverside Drive. His description of his mental state at the threshold has been confirmed across multiple separate interview sources. He felt like a heavyweight boxing champion going in against amateurs. The word invincible appears in the same context, not as bravado in retrospect, but as a description of the specific clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and understanding with reasonable certainty that the people on the other side of the wall don't have equivalent preparation. 4 gunmen who had done their reconnaissance, committed to their attack, and now found themselves in a siege situation, barricaded, running low on the initiative that had given them the early advantage, against a man who had spent 27 years being selected and trained for precisely the moment when the support structure hadn't arrived yet. He went in. Inside the compound, the atmosphere that CCTV footage and witness accounts reconstruct is one of exhausted fear, punctuated by bursts of violent noise. People had been hiding for an indeterminate period. In offices, under desks, in bathroom stalls, behind filing cabinets, waiting for information that wasn't coming through their phones fast enough to be actionable. The compound's layout, once the attackers had pushed past the initial entry points, meant that hundreds of people were scattered across multiple buildings with no clear sense of where the gunmen were at any given moment. Moving felt dangerous. Staying felt unbearable. Some people had been in that state for 15 minutes, others for over an hour. Craighead moved through that environment. The balaclava covered his face. The agent insignia on the shield patch at his vest was visible to anyone who looked closely. He wasn't in military uniform, jeans and body armour rather than the standard tactical kit that would signal British Special Forces to anyone who understood the indicators. To civilians hiding behind locked doors, he would have appeared as an armed man in civilian clothing and tactical gear, shouting at them to move. The nature of that moment, a masked man with a rifle announcing himself through a locked door, required a different kind of communication than standard room clearance. He and Dan Prestalo, the Slovenian operator from the Diplomatic Protective Service's Tactical Response Unit, who joined him during the interior phase, developed a solution that is documented across multiple independent sources. A call sign. When they needed people hiding behind locked doors to open those doors, they announced themselves as Eagle Eagle Security Forces. Not a Special Forces designation, not a Kenyan police call sign, not a British military identifier. A phrase that was invented in the field to solve a specific operational problem under fire. It worked because it had to. People heard the call sign, weighed their fear of the men behind the door against their fear of the men they could hear firing somewhere else in the building, and opened. Craighead and Prestalo got them moving. Out of offices, down stairwells, through parking structures, toward exit points in the perimeter where Kenyan police and security personnel were waiting to receive them. Then they went back in. That cycle, enter, clear a section, bring people out, re-enter, repeated across roughly 19 to 22 hours from his initial entry, depending on the account. The cycle is consistent across essentially every account of his movements during the siege. He wasn't positioned in a single hold point, conducting coordinated sweeps with a full team. He moved through the compound in the way the environment allowed, opportunistically, quickly, using his knowledge of the layout and his ability to read the changing position of the gunmen to identify which sections of the compound could be cleared safely for evacuation and which couldn't yet. The photographers from AFP, Reuters and Kenyan outlets who had been near the complex captured moments from this cycle at the exterior. The plate carrier, the balaclava, a woman being guided toward the perimeter with one hand on her shoulder and his C8 in the other. A group of office workers moving in single file behind him through a parking structure entrance. Those images were taken in real time. They went into the wire service distribution system before the siege ended. By the time Kenyatta announced the operation over, the photographs had already left the control of everyone in them. The Kenyan GSU Recce Company conducted organized operations throughout. The US State Department's official account credits the Recce Company with escorting more than 700 individuals out of the complex during the full 19-hour operation and with engaging at least 2 attackers. One GSU officer died in the fighting, included in the final toll of 21 people confirmed killed when the operation ended. The Australian High Commission security detail exchanged fire with the attackers in the early phase, wounding one of the gunmen. The compound's perimeter was managed by Kenyan police. A coordinated, multi-agency operation was running throughout. The accurate picture of Dusit D2 isn't a single man against 4 terrorists in an empty building. The 700 people who walked out alive did so because of the totality of that response. The Recce Company's systematic evacuation, the Kenyan police holding the perimeter, the private security operators on scene, the Australian detail, Dan Prestalo, and the man who arrived from the training compound and went through the gate without authorization. The story belongs to Nairobi before it belongs to anyone else. The 21 people who died there were predominantly Kenyan. The survivors were predominantly Kenyan. The GSU officers who died and who rescued hundreds were Kenyan. Kenya didn't need rescuing on January 15th. It needed, and largely had, the institutional response it had spent 5 years building after Westgate. What Craighead provided was the early phase, before that institutional response was fully organised. He moved faster and deeper than the assembled forces behind him in the initial hour, and he bought the time that the recce company then used to systematically complete the evacuation. The 20 civilians he is documented to have personally extracted from the compound during active fire, the most conservative figure, drawn from reporting on his blocked memoir, isn't 700. It's a specific, verifiable contribution to a collective outcome. He has framed the larger number accordingly, presenting it as what others have attributed to the full operation, rather than claiming it as his personal tally. Officially, he is confirmed to have shot and killed at least 2 of the attackers. Some later reporting, and reportedly his own unpublished account, attribute a higher number. But the total attackers killed by all responding forces across the 19-hour operation was 5. 5 men entered the compound on January 15th. By the morning of January 16th, 5 were dead. At approximately 8 a.m. on January 16th, Uhuru Kenyatta stood before cameras. The security operation at Dusit complex is over, and all the terrorists have been eliminated. He described 19 hours, 21 confirmed dead, 27 wounded. Nearly a year later, on January 3rd, 2020, hotel nurse Noel Kidaliza, critically injured in the attack and never recovered, died in hospital, bringing the final toll to 22. The photographs were already everywhere before Kenyatta finished speaking. During the siege, press photographers from AFP, Reuters and Kenyan outlets had positioned themselves near the complex's perimeter and captured what they could see at the exterior. Moments when Craighead or the people behind him emerged into open sight. The images are specific: the plate carrier, the balaclava, the C8 at the low ready. And on the vest, clearly visible to anyone who examined the photographs carefully enough, a distinctive shield patch with the word agent, a piece of kit that flagged his function without identifying his organisation or nationality. That detail, the agent insignia, drove the initial identification speculation. Online communities and military-adjacent forums in the first days after the siege generated competing theories about who the masked man was and where he came from. The visual signature was unlike standard Kenyan police kit, unlike standard British military kit in its usual configuration, and unlike anything from the commonly photographed NATO Special Forces community. The Guardian ran the photographs. The Independent ran a piece titled, "Who was the SAS soldier with pirate badge pictured?" Major international wire services distributed the images into an archive that is, by design, permanent and global. By March 3rd, 2019, less than 7 weeks after the attack, the Reptile House blog, a specialist military commentary site with a readership that skews toward people who know the difference between kit types, used a name that it treated as already recognizable shorthand: Obi-Wan Nairobi. The name had emerged somewhere in the specialist online space between January 16th and that March date. The blog post treats it as established rather than inventing it. Kenyan media and Kenyan social media adopted it readily. A second nickname also circulated in the same communities: Nairobi Ninja. But Obi-Wan Nairobi was the one that travelled. The nickname carries more information than it appears to. Obi-Wan Kenobi is a figure who operates past the formal structures of the institution that trained him, in a crisis that younger and more organized forces can't immediately address, moving alone through a situation that the rules of his world say should require a team. When people reached for a cultural frame for the masked man in the photographs, they found one that encoded both the effectiveness and the solitude. There is something accurate in that instinct. In September 2020, more than a year after the attack, the balaclava came off publicly for the first time. He went public on Instagram under his own name, Christian Craighead. The cover, in any operational sense, had already been burned by the wire service archive. The Instagram account was the formal acknowledgement of what the photographs had already accomplished. In the world of covert military operations, cover isn't cosmetic. An SAS warrant officer working in foreign countries, training allied forces, participating in sensitive advisory operations, moving through environments where his government's involvement must be deniable, depends on invisibility as a professional precondition. Once his face is attached to his function in the international photographic record, that precondition is gone. Not for one deployment, not for one country, not for one tour of duty. For all of them, permanently. The photograph is an operational end state. The SAS's value in covert advisory and counter-terrorism support roles rests on the fact that the people conducting those roles are unknown. Once known, they become a different kind of asset, a public one, which is to say, in those specific terms, not an asset at all. The Ministry of Defence confirmed, as it always confirms in these situations, that it does not comment on Special Forces operations. Its only recorded public statement on the broader question noted that past and present employees must uphold their contractual confidentiality obligations, and that breaches are considered on a case-by-case basis. He was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, second highest gallantry decoration in the British military system, one grade below the Victoria Cross, awarded for acts of conspicuous gallantry in the face of the enemy. The institution signed his name to it. He also received the MBE, two formal acknowledgements, both on the public record, both representing the British government's official position that what Christian Craighead did at Dusit D2 was exceptional by any measure the military uses to evaluate courage. Then, reportedly, a senior military figure told him he was a poor example for young soldiers. The specific criticism, as Craighead has described it in posts and interviews, not in any officially released MOD document, characterised his behaviour at Dusit D2 as reflecting a mutineer attitude that recruits shouldn't emulate. The framing deserves attention rather than dismissal, because the concern it expresses is institutionally coherent, even if its delivery wasn't. The SAS wasn't designed to produce solo operators. That needs to be said clearly, because the legend that Dusit D2 generated tends to obscure it. The regiment operates in four-man patrol structures. Sanctioned counter-terrorism operations involve coordinated entry teams, pre-breach planning, command authorization, designated roles, and careful deconfliction procedures. Mechanisms that exist because a coordinated team clears a building faster, safer, and with lower civilian casualty risk than one man moving alone through unknown space. The logic isn't bureaucratic caution, it's the accumulated product of lessons about what goes wrong when those procedures are absent. The institution's concern, as reported through Craighead's own account rather than through any official statement, was precedent. An operator who self-deploys without orders, enters an active siege on personal judgment, and succeeds, that operator becomes a template. Young soldiers watch and they remember.
The overwhelming majority of soldiers who would attempt to replicate that template don't have 9 years in Pathfinders and 15 years in 22 SAS behind the decision. They have the idea that it worked once for this man under these conditions, and the memory of the photographs. His response to the characterization has been consistent across multiple platforms, and it invokes the regiment's own motto: "Who dares wins, not who asks for permission wins." The line is pointed and deliberately so. It aims the institution's own foundational aspiration back at the concern that aspiration's product created. The paradox at the centre of what happened is genuine, not manufactured. The SAS spent decades and enormous institutional resources building Craighead into a man capable of exactly what he did on January 15th. The selection process selected for it. The Pathfinder years developed it. The SAS service refined and deployed it. The training produced the judgment. The judgment produced the decision to cross the threshold. The decision produced the rescue. The rescue produced the photographs. The photographs produced the problem. Every link in that chain is the direct consequence of the one before it. The institution can't fairly be surprised by the result of its own work. And yet, the result of its own work is precisely what the institution discovered it couldn't accommodate. Not because of what Craighead had done, but because of where he had done it, in front of an international wire service archive running in real time. Craighead retired from the British Army in 2020 after 28 years of service, 15 of them in 22 SAS. Whether that retirement arrived on its natural timetable or was shaped by institutional pressure is a question the publicly available record leaves genuinely unanswered. He has spoken around it in interviews rather than through it. He moved to Texas. He now works in training, security consulting, public speaking, and Christian faith-based advocacy. His Instagram account, under his own name, carries the biography line, "Here I am, send me, skilled and relentless good guy." 440,000 followers as of current records. He wrote a memoir about Dusit D2. He titled it "One Man In." On October 3, 2023, Mrs. Justice Steyn of the UK High Court refused permission for it to be published. The court's own summary of the judgment described him as being prevented from giving an account of an operation he had engaged in as a member of UK Special Forces. The MOD's position, conveyed through a spokesperson, was that employees, past and present, must uphold contractual obligations, breaches of which are considered case by case. As of mid-2026, Craighead is reportedly preparing to publish the book in the United States, in what amounts to defiance of the UK restriction, and has indicated he is seeking American political support for that effort. The book that the British government won't allow him to publish is about the operation for which the British government gave him its second highest gallantry decoration. Both things are true. They aren't in contradiction with each other, which is the point. There is a line that many people attribute to George Orwell, that people sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. The attribution is wrong. The line was coined in 1993 by a journalist named Richard Grenier, writing in the Washington Times, paraphrasing an idea that genuinely runs through Orwell's essays. In a 1942 piece about Kipling, Orwell wrote that men can only be highly civilized, while other men, inevitably less civilized, are there to guard and feed them. Grenier sharpened that observation into a memorable formulation, placed Orwell's name alongside it, and the result has been recited ever since in military communities, political speeches, and the comment sections of videos about the Dusit D2 attack. The idea is Orwell's, the words aren't, and the misattribution itself is instructive, because the phrase has survived for 30 years not because people carefully verified its source, but because it articulates something true about a transaction that liberal democracies prefer not to examine at length. The rough men are built. They are deployed invisibly. The arrangement is never discussed at the level where it would require a policy decision about what they are owed in return. The country simply sleeps, and the rough men work, and the two sides of that contract don't meet in public. Dusit D2 interrupted the contract in the most direct way possible. Not through a leak, not through a whistleblower, not through any failure of institutional security, but through the elementary fact that an active terrorist siege in a major city in 2019 generates photographs, and photographs enter the archive the moment the first shutter opens. Craighead didn't choose to be seen. He chose to enter a burning compound without orders on a Tuesday afternoon because a colleague called, and because 27 years of training had produced a man who didn't experience that moment as a difficult choice. The cameras were already there. They were the condition of the modern city, and no one had a plan for that. The CGC is real. The memoir is blocked. The retirement happened. The man who earned all three now lives on a different continent, speaks publicly about faith and instinct and the obligation to move toward the sound of the guns, and has 440,000 people watching him do it. What does a country owe the rough man once his face is known? The conspicuous gallantry cross answers one dimension of that question. The blocked memoir answers another. The retirement, whether it arrived naturally or was eased along by institutional preference for silence the documents don't confirm, is the quiet full stop at the end of a sentence the institution never finished writing out loud. The record stands where it stands. A man who saved lives, was decorated for saving them, was reportedly criticised for saving them the wrong way, and was then required to disappear. The country sleeps. It doesn't ask about the guarantee. That, as the misattributed Orwell line almost correctly observes, is rather the arrangement. Subscribe for more stories like this.